All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to have you back in today's class. Last week, we started talking about cell and its environment, and we were able to run through some of the terminologies, and we also discussed a brief about diffusion. So today we'll be doing a recap of what we did last week, and then after that we will continue with our class today. It's going to be a quick class so that we'll be able to finish this particular chapter that we are dealing with. All right, then probably next week Sunday we'll answer some questions and take some past questions regarding WAEC. Okay, so let's continue. Last week we talked about cell and its environment. So we previously looked at cell and we said that cell is the smallest unit of life. We looked at different kinds of cells. We looked at the eukaryotic cell and the prokaryotic cell, and we were able to draw differences and similarities between these different kinds of cells. And we also looked at the different structures in the cell. We talked about the nucleus, the vacuole, the mitochondria, the ribosomes, the Golgi apparatuses, and all of that. Different structures inside the cells. And we also talked about the functions of some of these structures in our previous class. And I believe I shared the slide for it. So today we'll be looking at cell and its environment. So let's quickly go to the introduction. All right. So cell and its environment, when we are talking about cell and its environment, what we are talking about is the activities that go on, or the activities that happens in the environment of a cell. All right. Cell is found somewhere. All right. Every part of, as a human, our body is made up of different types of cells. There is red blood cell, there is dermal cells, that's the skin cells that make up the skin. So they are called the somatic cells. All right. So there are different types of cells. Right. So the activities that happens in regards to these cells are what we'll be looking at, because there are some activities that happens and the cell will shrink. All right. There are some activities that will happen and the cell will return back to its original position. So that's what we'll be looking at. Okay. And there are some activities that can be harmful to the cell. So this is what we are looking at in our discussion for this section. All right. So we looked at the terminologies: receptor proteins. They bind specifically to single molecules. We call it ligands. They bind specifically to a specific ligand. We talked about the concentration gradient. This is the particular location. There is in a solution right now, or in a, let me use a solution. There is, sometimes we'll have a region of higher concentration, sometimes we'll have a region of lower concentration, or sometimes the solutes will be evenly distributed. So when we have an area of higher concentration distinct from an area of lower concentration, we can say that a concentration gradient, we can say that we have a concentration gradient. All right. Yeah, a distinction within the concentration of a substance across an area. So when we talk about an equilibrium is when they are evenly distributed, equal throughout an area of lower concentration, area of higher concentration. There is no distinct. All right. Diffusion, the movement of a substance from a region of high concentration to a region of lower concentration, caused by random movements of particles of the substance. So there cannot be movement from one region to another if there is no random motion. All right. What causes the movement of these substances is triggered by the random motion. If they are just there, nothing triggers them to move, then there will be no movement, they will just be accumulated at a particular spot. But diffusion, which enables substances to move from a region where they are highly concentrated to a region where it is less concentration, is caused by random movement of particles of the substance. So we need to get these things, we need to get these details. All right. Let's take for instance. Let's take for instance, we know what is currently happening in the world right now between Ukraine and Russia. All right. I just want to use it to explain what is happening in diffusion. You know, Ukraine was stable before, all right, until the attack from Russia came. People began to move from Ukraine, which is a concentration, which is highly concentrated with Ukrainian citizens, to other regions for safety. Why? Why did they start moving? Because there is a motion triggered by war. Right? Something was triggered by war, and they began to move from the region of higher concentration of Ukrainian citizens to a region where there is a lower concentration of Ukrainian citizens. So that is basically how diffusion happens. Substances move from where they are highly concentrated to where there is low concentration, triggered by random movement of particles of the substance. So osmosis is the diffusion of water particles, the diffusion of the movement of water through a selective semi-permeable membrane. So when we go into discussion, into details on osmosis, you will get to understand how these waters move. All right. Then hypertonic solution. Hypertonic. Hypertonic. They are solutions that causes a cell to shrink. They causes the cell to shrink. When we get to that point, you will know why hypertonic solution causes the cell to shrink. Hypotonic solution causes the cell to swell. All right. The opposite of shrinking is swelling. If something is not shrinking, it is swelling. If it is not swelling and shrinking, then it is normal. All right. So that is hypotonic. Hypertonic causes the cell to shrink as a result of activities. Hypotonic causes it to swell. Isotonic is when there is no modification in cell volume. When there is no modification, that's isotonic. All right. So let's move on. We talked about active transport, movement of chemical substances across the cell membrane against a level gradient. We talked about passive transport, passivated diffusion, sodium potassium bond, endocytosis, exocytosis. We looked at some of these things last week. All right. And I remember there was also a time I shared this particular website with us, learn.simbibot.com. It would enable the students very well. Okay, let's continue. Let's move on to diffusion. Okay, what is diffusion? What is diffusion? Diffusion is the movement of particles, atoms, ions, or molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration caused by random movement of the particles until an equilibrium is attained. That definition is very, very important. It is very, very important that you put until an equilibrium is attained. Until an equilibrium is attained. For instance, if somebody farts in a room, when somebody mess in the house, right? Let me use what we understand. If somebody mess in the house, what happens? It starts from that particular place where the person stayed to release the mess, and then it gradually spreads across the room, and every place will be smelling with the mess. Right? That's a typical example of diffusion. That's typically what happens in diffusion. Are you with me? That's typically what happens in diffusion. So the movement of particles. The particles can be atoms. The atom, the smallest atom is the smallest unit of an element, just like the cell is the smallest unit of life. Ions talked about the charges, the molecules, which can be a combination of um, atoms. Combination of atoms gives you a molecule. So diffusion is the movement of these particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration caused by random motion of these particles until an equilibrium is obtained. Now, see what they said here. Liquid and gases undergo diffusion as the molecules are able to move randomly. That is why I gave the example of fat, mess. When somebody mess in the house, the mess is a gas, a metabolic waste from the body is a gaseous waste. All right, examples of diffusion. Now let's look at some of the examples of diffusion. When you place a drop of red food coloring, when you place a drop of red food coloring in a beaker of water, eventually the entire beaker of water will be colored. That's a simple example of diffusion. Now, sugar will diffuse through tea until the entire cup of tea is sweet. We stir the tea to speed up the diffusion. You see what I am saying? Caused by random motion of the particles. Caused by random motion of the particles. This example of sugar and tea right now, if you put the sugar, it will gradually dissolve. But when you enforce a motion by stirring it, it spreads faster, right? A spray of perfume or air freshener will get diffused into this air and gradually spread across every part of the room. When you add boiling water into dried noodles, the water diffuses, causing rehydration and making the noodles plumper and saturated. So these are examples. Carbon dioxide entering the stomata of leaves, oxygen diffusing out of the stomata and length cells of the leaves. So now, these are typical examples. In WASSCE, they might ask you, give typical example of diffusion. Typical example of diffusion. You can remember some of these things when you place a colored substance into water. It will change the color of the water. When you put sugar into a tea and you see it, the sugar will spread, will be dissolved, and then cause the tea to be sweet as a result of the sweetness in the sugar. When you spray a perfume in the room, it will gradually fill up the whole room, right? Carbon dioxide entering the stomata of leaves. Plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Now, where the carbon dioxide enters from is the stomata. We know that plants takes in carbon dioxide, that's carbon dioxide, they take it in. Where this carbon dioxide enters through is the stomata, and they release oxygen. How does this oxygen go out? It's through the stomata also and the length cells. Right? The stomata is more like the gaseous mechanism of plants. Okay, let's continue. Types of diffusion. We have simple diffusion and we have facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Those are the types of diffusion. Now, what is a simple diffusion? Now, simple diffusion is that process whereby these particles, these substances, move through a semi-permeable membrane without the help of any transport protein. Without help from transport proteins. Transport proteins are proteins that help in the movement of substances or materials from one point to another. For instance, hemoglobin helps in the transport of oxygen in the blood. So is an example of transport protein. Okay, for example, bacteria deliver small nutrients, water, and oxygen into the cytoplasm through simple diffusion. So let's get this. Simple diffusion, these substances move through the semi-permeable membrane without help from an active protein, a transport protein, sorry, without help from a transport protein. Now, facilitated diffusion is the movement of molecules across the cell membrane from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration by means of a carrier molecule, or what we call transport proteins. Transport proteins by means of carrier molecules or transport proteins by means of carrier molecules or transport protein. Now let's look at factors. Factors affecting diffusion. Factors affecting diffusion. Factors affecting diffusion. 1. Extent of the concentration gradient. The greater the difference in concentration, the more rapid the diffusion. The closer the distribution of the material gets to equilibrium, the slower the rate of diffusion. The greater the difference in concentration, the more rapid the diffusion. Now, what this thing simply means is this. Just bear in mind that diffusion is the movement of molecules or particles from a region of higher concentration. Now, what the extent of the concentration gradient means is, as long as there is a region where the concentration is high, there would always be a high chance of diffusion. But as the concentration reduces from there, the diffusion gets slower. The higher the concentration in a particular area, the higher the diffusion. That's what it means, the extent of the concentration gradient. The higher the concentration, the higher the diffusion. Just get it at that basic level. The higher the concentration, the higher the diffusion. Now, mass of the molecules. Number 2, mass of the molecules diffusing. The heavier the mass, the slower the diffusion. Just get it also. The heavier the mass, the lower the diffusion. The lighter the mass, the higher the diffusion. The heavier the molecules of the particles, the slower the diffusion. The lighter the molecules, the faster the diffusion. Just get it. Mass of the molecules and extent of the concentration gradient. Just get these simple explanations that I am giving. Provided there, number 1, provided that there is a region of higher concentration, diffusion will always happen. Now, the higher the concentration, the higher the diffusion. The lower the concentration, the slower the rate of diffusion. Mass of the molecules diffusing. The higher the mass, the slower the diffusion. The lighter the mass, the faster the diffusion. Temperature. Number 3, temperature. Temperature. Higher temperature increases the energy and therefore the movement of molecules. So the higher the temperature, the higher the rate of diffusion. The lower the temperature, the lower the rate of diffusion. So these things are very simple. These things are very simple. Number 4, solvent density. Solvent density. Solvent density. As density of a solvent increases, the rate of diffusion decreases. So the density of the solvent is like the fluid, let me use the word fluid, that you use to form a solution. Now, solvent plus a solute equals solution. Now, if the density of solvent is high, the rate of diffusion will be low. If the density of the solvent is lower, the rate of diffusion will be high. Solubility, 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 solubility. Non-polar or lipid soluble materials pass through the plasma membrane more easily than polar materials. Surface area and thickness of the plasma membrane and distance traveled. Now, the greater the distance that a substance must travel, the slower the rate of diffusion. So let's get this thing right. Let's get this. If you feel you missed it, you can always go back to watch the videos. If you missed it, you can always go back to watch the video. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry about that. I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. I want to attend to something now. I would be back. Let me pause the record. Sorry for the delay in the lesson. So we'll be continuing. Though our time is just 2 minutes remaining. So, but we would continue. Okay, so we'll be moving on to the next thing we have here. We're moving on. Importance of diffusion. So let's look at the importance of diffusion. So what is the importance of diffusion? This process helps in diffusing carbon dioxide gas out through the cell membrane into the blood during respiration. So for humans, diffusion helps to take carbon dioxide out through the cell membrane into the blood during respiration. So during respiration, it takes carbon dioxide out to the cell membrane, out through the cell membrane into the blood. So diffusion also occurs in plant cells. In all green plants, the water present in the soil diffuses into plants through the roots hair and goes from there to the leaves. So diffusion occurs in humans. It also occurs in plants. In humans, it helps in taking away carbon dioxide through the cell membrane into the blood. For cells, it helps in the movement of nutrients and water from the soil through the leaves to other parts where it is needed. The movement of ions across the neurons that generate electric charge is due to diffusion. So in our central nervous system, Our neurons also need charges to operate very well. So for these charges called anions to be able to move across the nervous systems, it is also as a result of diffusion.